Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode at amazic.com, where we talk to industry leaders and influencers on various topics within the cloud native space. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at amazic.com. And if you've not heard of Amazic, it's a place where we collect some of the best and the most timely ideas in the cloud native space in the form of articles, interviews like this, event coverage, and we also have job listings on the website. So if you're in this space, which if you're watching this, I know you are, then head over to amazic.com and follow us and keep track of what we do, because you'll find some really interesting stuff. And you'll also find some really cool people who talk and share their views. And we have one of them with us today. So we have with us today Anders Eknert. He's developer. He's the developer advocate at Styra, and Styra is the company that is behind and is the creator of the really popular open source project, Open Policy Agent. So we're going to talk about that and a whole lot more today. So Anders, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Wayne. Good to be here.
All right. So the focus today is going to be authorization. We're going to talk all about authorization because that's what Styra really focuses on, and Styra really does best. So I want to start with something basic, about if you can tell us the difference between authorization and authentication, because they sound similar. A lot of people get them confused. And so I think this is kind of like a great starting point. What's the difference between these two terms?
Yeah, that's a good starting point. And I think, especially for me, like my background is in identity systems. So I've been working with authentication for a whole lot of years before finally like coming here, working on more on the authorization side. So basically, authentication is kind of deeply connected to identity. It's a way to prove that you are who you say you are in digital systems. And you can do that by any number of means. Like, of course, there are things that you and only you know, like a password, but there could also be things that that you possess, like your phone, or things so anything that kind of helps to assert that you are who you say you are. That's kind of authentication. And authorization is basically what you're allowed to do in any system. So authentication commonly kind of precedes authorization, since in order to know what you're allowed to do, you basically need to know who is this user, right? And that could be anything. Like it could be like a user ID, it could be name, email address, and so on. But commonly there are more attributes from that authentication, which is things like roles or attributes that we can then use to kind of map that into permissions, which is basically saying things like any doctor should be allowed to view like the medical records of their patients, but only of patients under their care, things like that. So that's basically authorization. And I think like in any digital system, you're going to find like authentication and you're going to find authorization. So yeah, it's a pretty good space to be in. There's a because it's basically everywhere. So
yeah, it's pretty sweeping. So that's a great starting point, I think. And put it in simple words, authentication lets people in. Authorization says what they can do once they get in.
Right.
And in the past, typically these are sort of been clubbed together, tools that, have sort of done both at the same time. I'm thinking Active Directory and the likes. But now we're seeing more specialized tools coming up, and these are there's more focus on each individual part of this. How do you see that progression? Do you see that as a healthy thing? Just what's your take on, especially you said you worked on both sides, the authentication and the authorization piece for a while. What's your take on just that evolution?
Yeah, I think that kind of evolution kind of came out of this explosion of like distributed system, microservices, and so on. So when you only have like one big piece of software, and it's all like in one programming language. You're using like one build system, one big like authorization library, and so on. You can kind of get along doing everything like inside of the application. Once you start to scale out and you have like hundreds of components just servicing a single request, and on top of that, you might have like 10s or 20 teams managing these services, and these services might be written in like 10 or 20 different programming languages using different frameworks and so on. So if they're all going to do like authorization in their own like framework or language or in their own way, there's going to be like it's going to be a mess, right?
Yeah.
So I think like the one of the ideas of OPA is to try and find a way to unify how we offer and how we work with policy, because that's basically what authorization is. Like it's a subset of policy, and policy is basically rules. So we try and find a way to describe rules of our system, and those rules should be applicable whether your app is written in like Ruby, Java, .NET, or whatever. So that's basically what OPA does, and I think I think like the graft of these distributed, heterogeneous, diverse components. That's basically why OPA is needed.
Got it. That's great. Yeah, so there's different kinds of people watching this, I'm sure. And there's this group of people who, very familiar with RBAC. They probably have been working with RBAC for years in different forms. And so they probably think, my back's covered with RBAC. Well, that kind of rhymes. But yeah, what would you say to them who think that RBAC is all I need and it covers me for, authorization, authentication, everything? I'm set with RBAC. Maybe I am. What would you say to people who come from that mindset?
No, I think like maybe you are. Maybe that is good enough. I don't think you shouldn't like necessarily force anything into your tech stack unless you really need it. But like, to put it very like briefly, I think RBAC is basically based on some roles of a user. Again, like if we go back to the example of a doctor, if you're a doctor, then you should be allowed to perform certain things in a system, like reading patient journals and so on. So but like, if you only account for roles, there might be things which aren't really covered by that. So let's say, for example, that you only want a doctor to be able to do these things when they are on duty. So if they're on vacation or they got off their shift, there's really no reason for them to read like patient journals or whatever. And obviously I just make these things up now. There might be good reasons for them to do that, but just an example of like, that's an attribute which isn't covered by role. Like if you involve like the day it is, or what time of the day it is, things like that, those are attributes which are not like easily covered by a role-based system. So that's basically ABAC, or attribute-based access control, which is, of course, like a role is also an attribute. So so RBAC is basically a very limited form of RBAC. But for a lot of systems, I think RBAC is good enough. And OPA doesn't really force any methodology or one of these on you. Like, you're free to use whatever works best for the system you're working on. But yeah, that's basically the differentiator. Like things like time and date, whether like is it snowing outside or not. Like you could probably come up with any number of like attributes, and some of them make sense, some others might not.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about that.
But it could be like, maybe you've done like 10 failed authentication attempts, and you want to limit, like, so that's kind of seems suspicious or things like that, and you want to kind of adopt or adapt what that user is allowed to do. If you think like, okay, this doesn't seem right, or it could be something like, hey, you logged in from Stockholm an hour ago, and now your IP address is somewhere in India, and you either found out like how to fly to India in like an hour from Stockholm, which would be impressive, or there's someone else behind that account. So things like that.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to get into more what the attributes. How do you make sure they don't go crazy with attributes that you can't get a hold of, you can't control? I mean, could it become that way? Who creates the attributes and all of that? But before that, I was hoping you could just tell us a bit about OPA and the idea behind it, how it was created, why it was created, and in brief how it works. If you could share a bit of light on OPA.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we kind of covered it already. Like, I think OPA kind of is born out of this need to have one unified way of describing policy and enforcing policy across like your whole tech stack. And we've been talking about authorization, but policy is like so much more. It's basically anywhere you want rules. And you kind of want to decouple those rules from the business logic of your application. And those rules could be anything. It could be whether someone is allowed to do something or not, but it could also be like, should we allow people to deploy like critical business software on a Friday afternoon, like 20 minutes before going down to the pub? Or should we allow like S3 buckets without a secure configuration? Should they be like publicly readable or not? And of course, so policy has been like in addition to authorization, things like Kubernetes admission control, where you kind of use policy to control what type of resources you want to allow or not. Policy for Terraform, AWS CloudFormation. So basically anything infrastructure, build systems, and so on. And all of these systems, or most of them, they have some way of working with policy. But the problem is, of course, that they all have their own way of working with policy. And what OPA tries to provide is like one unified way to offer policy, to test policy, to kind of manage the whole policy lifecycle independently of your application or your infrastructure or whatever it might be. So it's a way to decouple policy from anything else. So if you think, I think like a pretty good analogy is how databases, like, I don't know, 40 years ago, before that, you just had a file. Like one application, it would just manage state. And if it needed to do that, like persist that, it would just write that to a file. And then the database kind of decoupled that responsibility from your application, moved it out to a database, which brought a lot of benefits. And I think like policy, like, or the way OPA works with policy is pretty much the same way. You kind of move that responsibility out of your applications. So ideally, your applications, they don't know what is a role, what is a user. Once you made it that far, like OPA already made a decision that, yeah, this should be allowed or this should not be allowed.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And, there's also Rego that comes along with OPA, which is the policy language for OPA. If you could talk a bit about, why Rego and what's special about it.
Yeah, sure. So Rego is a declarative language, meaning rather than saying like exactly how you want something done, you just say what you want done, or you kind of describe the rules of the system. So you might say like, users should be allowed if this and this and that, this and that, or this piece of infrastructure should be deployable if all of these conditions are met. So that's basically how you describe things with Rego. And if you think about it, that's basically what a policy is in real life as well. it's a set of rules. So Rego kind of tries to mirror that in its language. And yeah, it is a new language. It is fairly different from what many are used to. Most people are used to these kind of imperative languages where you go from like from the
Step
first
by
line
step.
to the next line and so on.
Yeah.
While declarative languages work a bit differently. So yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve, but on the upside, again, you have one way of describing policy across like this diverse landscape of very different technologies and so on. So
is Rego similar to any other language out there, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's basically, it originates from Datalog. I think it's which is a logic programming language, which I don't think most people have experience with, myself included. So I think like the closest one that people know of would be SQL, since it's also it's a query language. A declarative one, you don't in SQL, you don't write for loops in SQL. You just say like, give me all users where their last login was today, or things like that. So and Rego works a lot like that. So
okay.
If you're a skilled like SQL hacker, you're probably going to have a pretty easy time like learning Rego.
Neat. Yeah, SQL is quite popular. So, talking about policy, for typically policies and rules, when you think of rules, you think security, and typically it was rules that stop you from doing stuff. But now I think, with the evolution of cloud native, we're talking about rules that allow you to do stuff. And, rules that are based on trust and stuff like that. So, I want to talk about just, how policies are going beyond security to help with infrastructure config, with networking policies, sort of not just security, but even the supply chain, the pipeline itself, and even the infrastructure layer, how policies are being used in those places which are traditionally not thought of as very rules based. It's typically manual.
Yeah, sure. Now, there was a lot of things like mentioned there, like supply chain, etc. But I think like one thing that I commonly like try and talk about or to mention is, I think like, I guess it's part of security, but in a different sense than what we kind of normally expect. And it's this idea, like, I think when we talk about security, there's a lot of focus on like being hacked or preventing, like, so we set up all these rules to prevent like hackers from gaining access to our systems, but in reality, like our worst enemy is often ourselves, right? So the odds or the risks or the chance of somebody actually like hacking into your system is probably not as big as the risk of you accidentally deploying something to production that you shouldn't have done, or accidentally deleting the production database or things like that. And obviously that's it's kind of security as well, but it's in a different sense, in a different kind of meaning. But it's kind of the sense of security that I can do things, I can work with this, and I don't need to feel that any simple typo or mistake is going to bring down the whole system. And I think like that's a huge space for something like OPA to help you, because these policies kind of build guardrails around your system. So if you say that I will not allow any deployment that kind of brings down like hundreds of nodes or machines, or I don't want to allow things to be deployed if they are obviously like misconfigured. What you're really protecting yourself against there is basically yourself and your teammates. And that should not be underestimated, because I think that risk is really what I think most of us have done stupid mistakes and things that like only a few of us actually ever got hacked. But pretty much anyone working in IT has sometime done something
stupid stuff.
stupid stuff, and it had like severe consequences.
Yeah.
So policy is great to set up the rules of the system to protect yourself and your teammates from doing those things. So yeah, that's kind of an angle that I like to lift up, to raise, and to.
Yeah. Can policies become overwhelming? Because if you're talking about policies that govern every single part of the system, that's going to be a lot of policies, right?
Yeah.
So kind of defining what those policies are in the first place, or startup with itself would probably take a long time. And then I think the bigger part is, how do you manage them in the long term? If you've got, let's say, hundreds of policies that affect different parts of the system, how do you keep track of? Won't that become a whole separate job in itself and distract you from, your product? And, do you think that would be a problem, or do you think there's another way of thinking of this?
Yeah, to some degree, of course. Like anything that grows beyond like very simple use cases, it's gonna take some time. It's gonna take some resources to manage. I think one of the benefits when you start to treat policy as code, because that's basically what we're doing here, is that you gain all the benefits from treating anything as code, which means like you can work with pull requests, code reviews, you can work with tests, you can work with linters, and so on and so forth. So I think, sure, all these rules, they're going to be there anyway, aren't they? Like, it's not like OPA does not invent the notion of rules.
Yeah,
that's basically a big piece of what any software is about. Like, there's going to be rules everywhere.
Yeah.
So what we're essentially doing here is like we're making it easier, because we're separating the rules of the system from things like the business logic or what have you. So I don't think OPA increase or OPA rather helps with the complexity of managing rules. And even more so when you have like your software defined in like 8 different programming languages, because how do you know, like, okay, where is this rule defined? You have all these hundreds of microservices, and where do you go look if, okay, you log in and you don't have, and you find yourself like, okay, I can't access this feature and I don't know why, and this system is comprised of like hundreds of microservices. Where do you start to look? Like, there's no single place where you manage your policy. So I think that's basically one of the benefits that OPA brings. Like, but of course, you're absolutely right. Even with OPA, once you have like thousands of rules or hundreds of policies, things are going to need like tooling in order to kind of manage that. And basically that's one of the things that Styra does really well. So Styra provides a control plane for OPA, where you offer policies, you can test policies, and you can manage deployment of policies like in a controlled fashion for like hundreds or thousands of services.
Yeah, I love that answer. I especially love what you said about the rules are going to be there anyway. And it came to my mind that, a lot of times the rules are unsaid. It's kind of like, it's not really defined. It's not really stated. It's just that it's somewhere there. Some few people know about it, many don't. So I think just having policies is a great way to make the unsaid to be said and defined clearly, so that everyone is aware, and it's a thing. It becomes a thing. So I think I really found that interesting from your answer. And another thing that you mentioned about it being software defined, means that the alternative is that people manually review code before it goes out, or any component, they review it manually, and that's the alternative. And rather than that, you could actually have a tool that actually does the heavy lifting for you. So it saves you a whole bunch of time from having to manually review. So being software defined, that's one of the big advantages, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. I think like another thing where in so many companies that I've been in the past, like one of the challenges is just finding out like who made this rule in the first place. So when you're a developer and you're working with your code, and then suddenly you kind of find out like, okay, so somebody made like an if statement here, like that if this user is this, and you just see like, okay, but why was this rule made, or and for what reason? And of course, it's probably not the developer who wrote that line of code who decided that. It was probably a manager somewhere, and you'd have no idea. So I think like just to have your policies and your rules as code and decoupled from that of your application logic, it's not going to solve all the problems, because there's still going to be like somebody's still going to have to make the rules. But if you have them all in a single place where you can actually just submit a pull request, if you think something like this should probably not be there, or this could be made like more, or this could be made better or improved somehow, just submit a pull request, and then we can start a discussion there. And like the rules are not locked into a PDF or a Word document somewhere, but they're all in code.
Yeah. As we wind down, I want you to just shed some light on just, Styra's product. It's Styra DAS, DAS, it's Declarative Authorization Service. How does it simplify things with managing policies at scale? When there are things like you just mentioned an example about, a developer needing authorization to do something that he doesn't have already, submits a pull request, stuff like that. How does Styra make all of that easier?
Right. So I think like the one big thing for me is kind of what Styra does is to manage the whole policy lifecycle. So it's basically you start out with offering policy. And one thing you'll probably find yourself want after a while is like, okay, we have this policy in like 20 of our microservices. Maybe we could make this into a library, or maybe we could make this into like some shared functionality between our teams. And that's one thing that Styra provides, like so you can share policy and rules across systems and teams. And it allows like a more collaborative approach to policy, but also like all these things like policy testing, deployment, and so on. And it doesn't just do this for authorization, but it does this for all these diverse like systems, like for infrastructure. So we have predefined rules for a lot of these systems. So if you're working with Terraform, you're going to find like a lot of things that you might just need. So if you're lucky, you might not even need to write policy, because what you need is already there. So it basically just makes it very easy to manage policy at scale.
Okay,
and there's
awesome.
and there's even a free edition these days. So if you want to try it out, like it's just a few clicks away.
Yeah, that's great. And I even love your website. It has a lot of great content on OPA and policies. I think there's even some courses, some mini courses on each of these topics. I really love that section. So anyone who's watching this really interested to know more, I'd encourage you to visit their website, Styra, and check out the courses they have and some of the other materials. Really great, informative stuff. As we finish, our last question for today, someone who's interested, excited about, I want this, I want policies, I don't want to be doing the manual way anymore. Where do I start? What's a low-hanging fruit? How can they get started easily? What would you advise for them?
Yeah, good question. I think like my usual suggestion is to start very small. Like there's the Rego playground where you can offer a policy and just like you can provide, okay, here's my input, here's the data I want to work on, write out. You don't even need to download OPA. So that's a great way to start. And once you're past that stage, I think like, again, start small, integrate OPA into one of your services, one of your apps. You don't need to rewrite your whole app. You can just start maybe at a single endpoint where you delegate like that responsibility over to OPA and see how that works out. And then you kind of take it from there, maybe one more endpoint, maybe one more role or user or what have you. And you kind of build confidence in what you're doing. And I think as for how to offer policy, like I think test-driven development, or at least like working with the OPA unit test framework really helps, because then you kind of catch any simple mistakes or errors you might have as early as possible so you can fix those.
Okay, awesome. If I could just stretch it with one more last question, if you don't mind. What's something that you're most excited about that Styra is working on? Probably something that's upcoming or something that recently launched. What excites you most about something that Styra released?
Oh, that's a good question. Like so I work in the OPA team, which is like the open source team. So yeah, I'm kind of so deeply involved in OPA development that I don't really know like all the things that recently released into Styra, but I think like some things that I think like are exciting about recent development in OPA is we recently added some like syntactic sugar for a few things. So a rule is basically saying something like allow if, and then it's followed by a body of conditions. And now you can actually type out that if. So now you can say allow if, and then followed by a condition or more conditions. So it's all of these small things, which just makes it more readable, more approachable for developers and so on. That's what I'm most excited about. I think like I know like Styra has a lot of nice like kind of enterprise features, but for me as a developer advocate, working with kind of developers trying to learn this, approach this for the first time, I think like those kind of small tweaks just to make it a little bit nicer, that's what I really like the most.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing all of those. That was really interesting. I loved our conversation. So Anders, before you go, a couple of questions to sort of get to know you a bit more. So yeah, a bunch of about 5 questions.
All right.
So yeah, here goes. Your alternate career path if not for your job in tech.
Oh, that's a really tough one. I think as a developer advocate, I do a lot of writing.
Ah, nice.
I wouldn't call myself like a very good writer or author, but I do a lot of blogs and so on. So if it wasn't for tech, I'd probably want to improve on that, improve my skills in that kind of space. So whether it's like technical blogs or not, or even a book or something, I think like it's something I really enjoy. So probably something around writing.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Really interesting. That's what I do most of the time. So yeah,
oh, nice.
It's a lot of fun.
All right. So if I ever leave the tech space, I might reach out then.
Yeah. The company you worked at for the longest.
Yeah, I think it's probably a tie between 2 companies. Like I don't have like a classical computer science background.
Okay.
I started out in sales, and I sold like hi-fi equipment, home cinemas, things like that.
Whoa.
And I even ran 2 shops, and I think I did that for 5, 6, 7 years before I kind of entered the tech space.
Really cool.
And in tech, I've been working for a company called Bisnode for a long time as well. And they're basically a one big provider of data, all kinds of data around like mainly around like government data, things, or when I say government data, I mean like addresses, credits, reports, like anything that kind of revolves around like personal information or information around companies and so on. So, and of course, any industry like that is heavily regulated, right? So that was a perfect way to find out about OPA, because that's basically and that's basically how I found about OPA, because we had a need for a way to describe, like we had so many rules working in that industry, and we really needed a way to kind of describe that in our, not just in like Word documents, but also in our code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, really interesting career path you had so far.
Yeah, it's been pretty wild.
Which time of the day are you most productive in?
As a father of two, we're like, my daughter is 2 years old and my son is 5 months old. So like right now it's definitely in the evenings. But I think even before that, yeah, it would probably be the evenings as well.
All right. It's more likely you can never tell, right? You just go for it when you can, because yeah, I've got a 4-month-old as well.
Yeah, but I think it's funny because like as an dev advocate, you have so many things like on your list of things to do. Like you have the things that we are doing now, like we're talking, and that's a big part of this, like having meetings, having like, I don't know, podcasts, interviews or whatnot. And there's a fair amount of coding still as well. And I think it largely depends, like what is the current like task. So I think coding is for the evenings, but having like good conversations or writing blogs, that's for some other time of the day. So it definitely depends, and it's kind of a fun challenge in this role to try and to make that puzzle work, where you kind of, okay, you spend 2 hours doing this before like switching over to something else.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to our next question, which is complete the sentence. Open source is
messy.
Okay. Neat. Your last sentence, your last question. What was the last thing you Googled? Don't know if you remember it right away, but.
Oh yeah, no, I'm working on a side project together with a friend, which is basically allowing us to run OPA in environments where it normally wouldn't run, like on the JVM and things like that. So definitely something around Java or interoperability, like, because things are things. So OPA is written in Go. And things are like different enough, but they're like usually not that different. So if you want to do something like with a string and you want to measure like what's the length of this string, and this string contains an emoji, you're gonna get like wildly different results depending on what programming language you want to or you're running with. And that's kind of interesting when you try and write a project that should like closely mimic OPA. So that's basically what we're doing. We're writing a little fun side project to have like OPA run on the JVM, and we're trying to kind of do all these things as closely to Go as possible in an entirely different environment. So something around that is basically what I've been Googling for the past few weeks.
Neat. Great. So that we come to the end of all our questions. If you could tell our viewers where they can find you and connect with you, that'd be great.
Of course. So yeah, on Twitter, it's just my first name followed by my last name. On GitHub, the same. On LinkedIn, it's the same. And if you prefer email, it's just anders@styra.com.
Awesome. Great. You got all those usernames.
Yeah, it's kind of keep it simple. Just first name, last name.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Anders. It was a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks so much for sharing with us so generously. And your enthusiasm is definitely catchy. I love just how much, you seem to be in love with OPA. And it's just great to see that.
Good to be here, Twain. I love this conversation too.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for yet another episode here on amazic.com. And if you loved listening to Anders today, I want to encourage you to go listen to all of the other episodes we've done thus far. And you'll find them really engaging. Head over to amazic.com. We've got a lot of articles on topics that we just spoke about today and other topics related to this. And we've got job listings. We've got event coverage like the KubeCon that happened recently, and lots more. So head over to amazic.com and don't miss that. With that, we come to the end. Thanks again, Anders. Signing off.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.